Few spots upon the earth's face have been so uninformedly pronounced deformities without having been seen. Non-hesitant to condemn it, it is deemed a land of miasma, contagion, and death. It bears the terrific and poetic title of the white man's grave. Its aspect is generally suspected to present an uniformity of flats, spongy with swamps, and dotted with tombstones over which poisonous fogs internally brood. Such opinions are prevalent. They are so occupied a mind as to supplant the interest due to the colony as the center of the headquarters of an operation for suppressing the traffic in slaves of African coast and the asylum and foster mother of the captives, with emancipated from the chains and the confinement of their prison ships. There's a black legend about the climate of tropical countries that lives on in spite of knowledge geographers, meteorologists, and specialists in tropical medicine have gained over the past half century. With all the recent publicity given to West Africa, most people in the Western world would carry a half-conscious image of the white man's grave. It is usually elaborated with such elements as primitive tribes, burning heat, fever-laden swamps, swarming insects, and miles of trackless jungle. Above all, West Africa is thought of as a place where white men cannot work. Only Africans can work there, and Europeans go out for brief periods at a considerable risk to their lives. Most of this image is of course quite false. Maximum temperatures on the West African coast would be moderate summer heat in the American Midwest. Insects are generally less annoying than they are in the United States. The forest is by no means trackless, but the home of sedentary agricultural people who have for centuries periodically cut it down to burn a place for their farms. Neither physical capacity for work nor immunity to disease is significantly different between Europeans and Africans on racial grounds. Still, the image was not made up from imagination alone. In its British version, it was based on facts. Facts misunderstood in Africa, reported at home, and repeated over several generations. Both the facts and the image have a part in shaping West African relations with Great Britain, and both the facts and the image have changed through time in significant ways. The early 19th century represents a crucial phase in these changes. British traders had been on the Guinea coast for 2 centuries before 1783, but the loss of the American War and the 13 colonies brought a new phase of Anglo-African relations. The old economic contact through the slave trade was under increasing fire in the Parliament, and demands of reform implied demands for new forms of overseas enterprise. Any thought of West Africa, however, had to begin with the facts of European mortality on the coast. There is no reason to believe that conditions in the later 18th century were very different from those of recent years when virtually the whole of West Africa is classified as an area of hyperendemic malaria. This means, among other things, that the chance of individuals living as long as a year in West Africa without receiving infective mosquito bite is extremely slim. In some areas, the average number of infective bites per person per year may range up to 100 or more. There is no escape from the infection, but its consequences may vary considerably. Among the local population, a child is normally infected shortly after birth. During the first years, he fights a life and death struggle with the parasites, and West African children under 5 years of age show a rate of infestation sometimes approaching 100 per infant. Infant mortality is extremely high. Those who survive childhood, however, acquire an apparent immunity from further attacks. This immunity, however, is completely effective only against the same strand of malaria they have known in childhood, nor is it true permanent immunity of the kind that is acquired from an attack of smallpox. It can weaken, even disappear unless an individual is constantly reinfected. But if he is reinfected often enough, he will rarely show any clinical symptoms of malaria. Even if reinfected only occasionally, the symptoms will be very mild, nothing more than chills and a slight fever. In a certain sense, then the African population pays the price in infant mortality for its later protection. European visitors in the past paid the same price in high mortality, but they paid it as adults and not infants. The facts about West African health in the late 18th century were first, hyperendemic malaria, second, relatively frequent yellow fever epidemics spaced out at about 5 to 10 years apart. Third, extremely high initial mortality for an intrusive population from the temperament zone. And fourth, a pattern of behavior on the part of both yellow fever and malaria which made it appear that Africans were immune. These facts could be interpreted in 18th century Britain at two different levels. At the level of sophisticated medical science, they were a problem of particular importance to military and naval medicines. The need to keep troops alive in the tropics was especially heightened during the 18th century wars with France, and tropical medicines was already an important branch of British medicine. At the same time, the germ theory of disease and cellular structure of body were unknown. Medical knowledge was still dominated by the tail end of the humoral pathology re-expressed through the 18th century tendencies to build medical systems. The essence of any of these systems was to see all pathological conditions as a result of a singular set of causes. The humoral pathology considered all diseases as an imbalance of impurity of the bodily fluids. Treatment therefore aimed at readjusting the balance by bleeding, purging, and the like. The Brunel system, which was a popular, insisted the problem was rather the balance of tone or stimulation in the nervous system. Thus, it aimed at stimulating and relaxing tension as needed, but the treatment was in fact the familiar bleeding and purging stimulants, tonics, and dietary rules. With this background, the explanation of European mortality followed naturally. The striking known facts were the Europeans died in great numbers, and the places they died in were climatically different from Britain. Thus, it was quite clear, or seemed to be, that the climate either threw the liquid balance out of order, or overstimulated the body, or performed analogous changes according to fancy or system. With this, and much earlier than the 1780s, climate and disease were inseparable and unequivocally linked. A bad climate was a climate where mortality rates were high. It was also a climate different from that of England. Therefore, people who had never been to West Africa assumed that a very high mortality meant very high heat and humidity. The African coast took on the popular reputation of a blazing furnace, and it held this reputation in spite of occasionally travelers' reports to the contrary. In point of fact, and speaking merely of human comfort, the choice between British and West African climates is so closely that only personal preference can swing the decision one way or another. The treatment of fevers in West Africa rested on a base of pure empiricism combined with incorrect theory. Remedies were used that satisfied the commands of medical systems or that seemed to bring relief, but practitioners seldom understood why they brought relief. Treatment, therefore, tended to change through time as systems rose and fell in Europe, or as empirical observation changed overseas. These alterations had important consequences for changing mortality in West Africa, since some forms of treatment were beneficial while others were downright harmful. The most valuable of all was the Genoa bark, and after the late 1820s, its derivative, quinine. The bark had been known in Britain since the 17th century, but it was especially prone to phases of popularity and unpopularity. The great Sydenham had disapproved of it, but in the later 18th century it was again popular, being supported by Forthill and by James Linn's Diseases of Hot Climates, published in 1768. Lynn recommended not only treatment with bark, but also regular prophylactic doses of bark in wine, and at least for those who had already experienced one attack of fever. This was an important discovery, since the regular use of bark, even in small quantities, would have had some effect in making malarial attacks less serious. Other practitioners tended to use other remedies such as bleeding, blisters, purging, or hot and cold baths, but the tendency of British practice in the last 2 decades of the 18th century was to lean heavily on bark. In the 1790s, however, there was a change. It came about because different fevers were not clearly distinguished, and Genoa bark is a specific only for malaria. Dr. Colin Chisholm in Grenada reported very poor results in the Genoa bark in treating an epidemic that was clearly yellow fever. The anti-Genoa school gained further converts for similar reasons in the early decades of the 19th century. By the 1820s, bark was very little used. An accepted remedy for tropical fevers was a combination of bleeding and mercury treatment from the calomel. The decline of Genoa and the rise of these new treatments almost certainly had some effect on European mortality in West Africa, though it is impossible to say that in quantitative terms what it may have been. We have numerous partial statistics on European mortality, but too few of them distinguish between the new arrivals on the coast and old residents. Two separate kinds of evidence are, however, available and throw some light on the matter. First, the subjective impression in the press comments, government reports, and traveler accounts indicates that Sierra Leone's reputation as the white man's grave was somewhat stronger in the decade of the 1820s than it was at any other time before or since. Second, modern medical opinion throws some light on the probable consequences of medical treatment at the time. The prophylactic use of quinine had been given up except in the Navy, where it seems to have been used only irregularly. After about 1815, the bark was taken only as a tonic to aid recovery and not in sufficient quantities and at a sufficiently early stage to do as much as good as the treatment prescribed by Lynn would have done alone. Thus, the most valuable form of treatment known was out of fashion. Furthermore, the new forms of treatment were positively harmful. General bleeding from a cut or vein increasing the quantities of blood taken with heroic. 20 ounces of blood is the amount normally taken for a blood transfusion today, and the human body is given generally accounted of containing about 180 ounces of blood. The normal practice of doctors in West Africa was to take 20 to 50 ounces at the onset of a fever, and more later for a total that would exceed 100 ounces. Since anemia is a common condition accompanying malaria, any victim needs all the blood he has. A second level of British interpretation of West African health conditions paralleled the development of medical science. As the doctors struggled unsuccessfully with the problems of survival in the tropics, the popular image of Africa as the white man's grave was borne home to the educated public. The facts were known to some of the 1780s, but they were not widely publicized. Over half a century, from about 1780 to 1830, the deadly climate of the African coast gradually became more common knowledge. It was still possible for ordinarily well-informed men to plan settlement colonies in West Africa to replace the lost 13 in America. One scheme picked the Gambia as a convict settlement. Others hit on the Banana Islands, Sierra Leone, the Bulima Islands, the Cape Meserado, where Monrovia now stands, and Southwest Africa. 3 of these projects were actually attempted to successive settlements at Sierra Leone in 1787 and 1791, and one at Bulima Island in 1792. The last was the only one with a substantial number of European colonists. The original settlers leaving England in April in 1792 numbered 269. By November 1793, all but 9 had died or deserted, and the project was given up by those who remained. Recent medical research indicates that the incidence of effective bites by anomalous mosquitoes is, if anything, higher in West African savanna than it is in the forest. The results of the expedition were completely in line with earlier experience on the coast. 35% of the Europeans who went to Africa on this occasion died there. The high mortality rate was the more discouraging in contrast to the optimistic publicity of the planners. The full impact of the news also came just after the Melbourne government had fallen. The New Peel government was less prone to humanitarian ventures in any case. It seized on the excuse of the death rate and ordered the expedition to evacuate. Thus, the image of West Africa as a white man's grave was more solidly set than ever. The opponents of the anti-slavery squadron rallied. The hope of this West Indian planters revived. They saw the opportunity during the remainder of the 1840s to try to regulate the equivalent of the old slave trade. By the importing contract workers from Africa, they could perhaps turn the tables of their Cuban and Brazilian competitors. Thus, Niger expedition is usually and in many aspects quite rightfully taken to be another major turning point in British African policy, another impetus to withdrawal like the Nadir of 1830. From another point of view, the Niger expedition marks the beginning of a new phase, and in quite a different way. From the 1780s onward to the early 1840s, the facts of European mortality in West Africa were relatively constant, while the European image of West Africa was gradually coming into line with the facts. After the early 1840s, they had learned their lesson, and the image was set, but the facts themselves began to change. In significant ways, the British were learning to cope with the climate, even though they knew little more about the nature of the causes of malaria and yellow fever. By the late 1840s, naval regulations had come to incorporate a good deal of practical information about the behavior of mosquitoes. Even though no one knew it was mosquitoes, they were in fact describing. The Navy, for example, had found out that crews going up rivers in boats or ashore for wood and water were liable to fevers, and these trips were restricted as much as possible. It had accurately calculated the incubation period for malaria so that a case of fever could be traced back to the probable source of infection. Enough was known about the behavior of yellow fever epidemics aboard ship to save some lives. With the first suspected yellow fever case, ships on blockade duty were ordered to leave for a cold climate. Enough was known about the range of Anopheles gambia, or malaria, and other African mosquitoes to keep ships at anchor at least a mile from shore. Another line of development was even more important. It grew out of an actual experience on the coast rather than academic science in England. Heroic bloodletting and heroic doses of calomel remained fixed in British practice in the 1850s and even later. Medical men in the Navy in Africa, however, had more occasional to see fever patients year in and year out. Their rebellion began in some cases even before 1830, but the important reforming publication was that of James Boyle, the colonial surgeon at Sierra Leone. In 1831, he opposed the practice of general bleeding and increased the use of Genoa bark, especially for the control of recurrent attacks. Within a decade, the free use of the lancet was uncommon on the coast, even though the less harmful leeches and local bleeding continued. This stage of progress was reached at the time of the Niger expedition, where patients were spared large-scale bleeding but still treated the calamine to produce salivation. During the 1840s, however, mercury also began to decline. The change went back to in part the work of Dr. William Stevens in Danish West Indies, but it also found echoes of West African coasts. So both reforms were taken up by the Navy through the efforts of Dr. Alexander Bryson in his official report on the climate and principal diseases of Africa stationed in 1847. Bryson had both the sense and the humility to recognize and realize that there was no direct cure for fever. It could be partly controlled by quinine. Beyond that, all the doctor could or should do was to make the patient as comfortable as possible. Seamen would still die of fever, but at least they were spared the additional agony of a nightcap blister, covering the whole of the scalp. The third important reform in medical practice during the 1840s is the introduction of regular quinine prophylactics against malaria. Like the abolition of bleeding and calomel treatments, it began with empirical experimentation on the coast, found its way into the official practice of the Navy, and from there was spread widely. It is impossible to say who invented quinine prophylactics, since prophylactic quinoa had never been died or out completely. It held its place in the official admiralty instructions to naval surgeons in spite of the general trend against Genoa in its first decades of the century. Quinine was used as a muscle relaxant by the Quechua people, who are indigenous to Peru, Bolivia, and Ecuador, to halt shivering. The Quechua will mix the ground bark of Genoa trees with sweetened water to offset the bark's bitter taste, thus producing something similar to tonic water. Spanish Jesuit missionaries were the first to bring the Genoa to Europe. The Spanish had observed the Quechua's use of Genoa and were aware of the medical properties the Genoa bark by the 1570s or earlier. Nicolas Mornendez and Juan Fregoso both discovered a tree which was subsequently identified as the Genoa tree, whose bark was used to produce a drink to treat diarrhea. Quinine has been used in unextracted form by Europeans since the early 17th century. The Jesuit Agostino Salambrino, an apothecary by training who lived in Lima, present-day Peru, absorbed the Quechua using the bark of the Genoa tree to treat shivering. While its effects in treating malaria or shivering was unrelated to its effect in controlling shivering from rigors, it was a successful medicine against malaria. At first opportunity, Salambrini sent a small quantity to Rome for testing of malaria treatment. In the years that followed, Genoa bark, known as the Jesuits' bark or Peruvian bark, became one of the most valuable commodities shipped from Peru to Europe. When King Charles II was cured of malaria at the end of the 17th century with quinine, it became popular in London. It remained the anti-malarial drug of choice until the 1940s, when other drugs took over. The form of quinine most effective in treating malaria was found by Charles Marie de la Condamine in 1737. In 1820, French researchers Pierre-Joseph Pelletier and Joseph Benin Covento first isolated the quinine from the bark of a tree in the genus Genoa, probably Genoa paspicine, and subsequently named the substance. The name was derived from the original Quechua or Inca people word for the Genoa tree bark, quina or quina, which means bark of bark or holy bark. Prior to the 1820s, the bark was dried, ground to a fine powder, and mixed into a liquid, commonly in wine, in order to be drunk. Large-scale use of quinine as a malaria prophylactic started around 1850. In 1853, Paul Briquet published a brief history and discussion of literature on quinoa. Quinine played a significant role in the colonization of Africa by Europeans. The availability of quinine for treatment had been said to be the prime reason Africa ceased to be known as the white man's grave. A historian said it was quinine's efficacy that gave colonists fresh opportunities to swarm into the Gold Coast, Nigeria, and other parts of West Africa. To maintain their monopoly on Genoa bark, the Peru and surrounding countries began outlawing the export of Genoa seeds and samplings in the 19th century. In 1865, Manuel Incra Mami collected seeds from a plant particularly high in quinine and provided them to Charles Ledger. Ledger sent them to his brother, who sold them to Dutch governments. Mami was arrested on a seed collecting trip in 1871 and beaten so severely, likely because of providing the seeds to foreigners, that he died soon after. For the future health of Europeans in West Africa, quinine prophylactics was probably the most important of all the medicinal forms introduced in the 1840s, but its consequences cannot be separated from the general improvement that came in the late 1840s. The direction of approximate magnitude of this change is clear enough. The best statistics of West African mortality are those of the African Squadron of the Royal Navy. Mortality per thousands of men's strength dropped from 65 per thousand in the period of 1825 to 45 to 27 per thousand in the period of 1858 to 67, and the sharpest decline centered in the mid-1840s. Demand for Genoa increased as European empires expanded throughout Africa and Asia. After it was discovered that quinine could also be used preventatively for malaria, the British Medical Department of the Army began using quinine as a prophylactic in 1848. The British government spent $53,000 importing Genoa bark annually until British geographer Sir Clements Markham introduced it to India in 1861. Genoa was then distributed throughout the southern regions of the country in British Ceylon. The Dutch also began growing their own Genoa in the 1860s, establishing plantations in Java and throughout Southeast Asia. Since the lower mortality rate from malaria enabled Europeans to live in the areas where the disease was prevalent, quinine has been seen as a tool of the 19th century colonialism that was critical for the empire expansion throughout Asia and Africa. Quinine's imperial role shouldn't be overestimated or detracted from. The complexity of colonization, it may not have been essential either. As William Cohen explains, the French were able to expand their empire throughout Africa despite their low usage of quinine. He suggests that the superior military tactics, not quinine, were the key to expansion. Although they had high rates of death from malaria, the French had low battlefield fatalities because they employed large numbers of indigenous troops, porters, and laborers. As their empire expanded, quality of life improved with better communications, regular delivery of food and medical supplies, and improved accommodations that lowered malaria rates. For those reasons, Cohen concludes, the lowering of the death rate must therefore be ascribed to the expansion of the French Empire rather than the achievements of medical science. There were several reasons for French reluctance to use of quinine as a prophylactics. There was no consensus on what was adequate of a dosage or frequent. It had side effects and also tasted extremely bitter. The Quechua people were indirectly responsible for what happened in Africa. I say indirectly because they had no way of knowing that the Jesuit missionaries were gathering or collecting information and sending it back home to help them expand their territories into the colonization of Africa. As we could see from early map making at that particular time, from the 1550s all the way to the 1880s, Europeans were very ignorant of Africa. They continued to draw out maps after maps after maps. The more they stayed in Africa and obtained information from their travels. But without quinine and coming across the Quechua people, they don't successfully obtain this information and continue to stay there. The white man's death was a reality and remained a reality for quite some time. But like all things, adaptation and mutation would have taken place, giving Europeans an opportunity to adapt to those climates and weather changes or come up with strategic ways to help them be preventative of sudden death, like the French and their calculated moves and the colonization of Africa is what it is and what it became to be.